All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Hello and welcome to the Actual Anarchy podcast, where we talk about movies from a Rothbardian and Anarcho-Capitalist perspective. And I'm singing for episode 115 of the show. We're going to do Les Miserables, the 2012 version starring Hugh Jackman and Russell Crowe, among others. We have a special guest who we will introduce on the Last Nighters portion of the show. But let's say hello to Robert. Can you come into this with some song for me?
Well, hello, everybody. I really didn't like this movie. It would have been a half an hour shorter had they not all been singing.
And I think the
That's
same
fine.
goes.
It's fine. It's just it wasn't for me. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I think we're going to have a lot to talk about, though, because there's a lot of character development and history around this thing, and a pretty decent story. There's a lot of situations that will be nice and chewy, meaty morsels to digestify here on the show. But let's do that on the Last Nighters portion. We will introduce our guest, Alex, and I will also have some special messages for everyone when we kick this thing off. So let's get into that Last Nighters portion of the show, shall we? Hey everyone, it's Daniel and Robert, the Last Nighters, and we might sing a little on this one. We're going to do Les Miserables with a special guest. This is episode 58 of the show, and you can find the show notes and more at lastnighters.com/58. You can also find the show on thelaunchpadmedia.com, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. We are a member of the Launchpad Media, and there are plenty of other shows worth checking out, so I do highly recommend them. Now, before I kick this thing off, I did want to mention that one of our friends of the show, he is one of our Patreon supporters. He is dealing with a medical condition. He has been diagnosed with cancer. So there is a GoFundMe set up. And if you guys are so inclined, our listeners, and you want to support a fellow listener, there will be a link on our show notes page. And there's also a quick link to get to it. You can go to lastnighters.com/Joe, Joe, and that will go to his GoFundMe. And anything that you can offer will help, or even just, positive vibes or whatever you got. So I just want to throw that out there. Let's say hello to Robert, and then we'll introduce our guest, Alex, before we get into Les Miserables.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be back. Glad to be here on this chilly winter day.
Indeed, it's about to get a heck of a lot colder and snowier where we are. So that should be a lot of fun. And our guest is Alex, and you are a listener of the Launchpad Media. I think you had told us in the pre-show that that's where you discovered us, and you have since listened to every one of our shows except, well, maybe not every one, but all but one. And so you approached us and said, I really think you guys should do Les Miserables. And I said, all right, you want to come on for it? And here we are.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we are definitely looking forward to this. And what we usually do is start off with the Google description, as you know, and I will ask you why. Well, before we do that, what made you think, hey, this is a show that you guys should do?
Sure. So I think a lot of the character development, specifically with Jean Valjean, is the main character. He deals with a lot of issues that I can relate to current times, be it criminal justice, the legal system, being trapped in the criminal justice system, his personal struggle against the law, sort of some concepts of legality versus morality. I find very interesting and worth discussing from the perspective that you guys adopt on this show.
All right, very good. Well, I agree. I think there's a lot to go over on this. So let's get into that Google description. Les Miserables, this is the 2012 version. It's a drama/romance/musical, 2 hours and 40 minutes. And I think Robert would agree with me that it could have been probably 40 minutes shorter had they sung just a hair faster or didn't sing every line. The IMDb gave it a 7.6 out of 10. Rotten Tomatoes, 69%. 63% on the Metacritic, and 91% of the Google users like it. Here's the description. After 19 years as a prisoner, Jean Valjean, played by Hugh Jackman, is freed by Javert, played by Russell Crowe, the officer in charge of the prison workforce. Valjean promptly breaks parole, but later uses money from stolen silver to reinvent himself as a mayor and factory owner. Javert vows to bring Valjean back to prison. 8 years later, Valjean becomes the guardian of a child named Cosette after her mother's death, and she was played by Anne Hathaway. But Javert's relentless pursuit means that peace will be a long time coming. This came out on Christmas 2012, which I think was right around the end of the world. To all the 2012 people out there who thought that I think it was the Mayan calendar or Aztec calendar meant we were all going to die. The director was Tom Hooper. This is the second movie we've done by him. We did The King's Speech a few months back. We will have that listed on the show notes page as well. The box office was $441.8 million. It's won a couple of Academy Awards. Best Sound Mixing, and I believe the Anne Hathaway performance got a supporting actress nod. So that is the description. Robert, what say you, sir?
Well, first of all, I want to preface all my comments. I am generally not the biggest musical guy, but I can watch a Disney movie. And I don't know if you're going to call a Disney movie, a musical. But I've seen musicals, and usually there's some dialogue and some plot development, and then they go into a song. And the song is usually like this well-crafted piece that advances the plot along. And then there's this movie. And this movie, there isn't like a well-crafted song because it's all singing, and no dancing. It's just all singing and misery and sadness, which is, fine. It's an interesting take. I've been familiar with this film. It's been done and redone many times. And I guess it's also like a Broadway play, I suppose. Been running forever. And it probably fits the stage a little bit better. But still, I struggled. I struggled with this one. I had to turn the subtitles on because I didn't know what they were saying half the time. And they're singing in English. But, it's all right. It wasn't a movie for me. Although there are interesting things to discuss. That's for sure. But I wouldn't say that I liked the film.
All right. Very good. So you're tipping your hand a little bit on the overall rating here. But I would agree there are lots of things to talk about. Like the example being straight off the bat is the disproportionate level of justice that was meted out against Valjean for stealing bread for his hungry relative. Now, that tugs at the heartstrings, of course, and he got 5 years of hard labor prison as a result of that. And then because of that injustice being carried out against him, he tried to escape, and that just tacked on more time to his sentence. And
that led to one of my big complaints about this film. I'm not sure what the movie is trying to be or what the story is trying to be. If it's Jean Valjean just escaping this persecution, or if it's a redemption arc, because it seems to be it's trying to be a redemption arc. And that only makes sense if he believes that he is a terrible person and what he did was really terrible. Like he's trying to redeem himself for these horrible acts. And so he takes on this, starving child, and he's going to raise it to be he's going to be a great parent and all this. But because there's several times during the movie where Gladiator's about to capture him, and he's like, wait, don't capture me just yet. I got this thing I got to do. Just one more thing, and then you can take me in because I totally deserve it.
I promise I'll come in.
I'm coming in. Just give me a minute. And Russell Crowe's like, nah, I heard that one before like a million times, bro. I'm not falling for it.
All right. Can I sidestep us for just a moment?
You can sidestep. That's what we do.
All right. So not to throw you off, but there was a funny story about somebody was being looked for by the police. And on Facebook, they had a conversation with the police department. And I'll try to find it and put it on the show notes page. But they were going back and forth about how, I'll turn myself in next Tuesday. And the police were like, all right, we'll be waiting for you. And then next Tuesday comes and the police are like, hey, buddy, you never showed up. What's going on? And it goes on for like a couple of weeks. And it's like freaking hilarious. So anyway.
That's awesome.
Reminded me of that, but continue, Robert, and then we'll go to Alex, who I think will be able to fill in some of this because when he suggested the movie, I was like, which one? Because there's like 5 different versions of this, and he said, well, kind of pick one, and I did. But I think one of the other ones at least gives us a little bit more of him being darker starting out and then more turnable.
Yeah, I mean. This is basically the world's most amazing cop, right? Because he's like going after this parole violator, which is like if someone violates parole for whatever, who cares? But so I'm totally on board with Jean Valjean in saying whatever he can to the super cop to leave him alone or to get out of it. I don't care if he's lying to the guy. It's an unjust thing, right? I mean, unless you actually believe that he deserves what he got, I don't care. So anyway, I don't know where we want to go, but I want to hear from our guest here and just break in and talk about whatever you got.
Well, sure. The first thing I guess I'd have to say that the Google description I thought was fairly decent. I mean, cut and dry. They described the events that happened. The one thing though that caught me was that they said that Valjean was freed by Javert, which is an interesting concept. That someone who's holding you captive releases you. That's not really freeing you. They're stopping enslaving you. So I think that's a very small element of our language that you find currently in places like the Bill of Rights gives you rights, things like that. The Bill of Rights doesn't give you those rights. It protects you from them. So to me, that one line kind of alarmed me a little bit. Javert frees Jean Valjean. So I guess that'd be the only complaint I would have with the Google description on that. As far as the whole, the song's not moving the plot forward, I'm very familiar with the story. I've seen it on stage several times. This is the only film version I've seen of it. So I'm familiar with the story enough to where maybe a new viewer wouldn't see the songs as moving it forward. But there was several scenes to me that were pretty powerful in developing the plot. Starting with the first one, I thought that the scene was just awe-inspiring. You see this huge mass of human beings that are all working together under the whip of the state, basically, to perform a needed task. And they're singing about, how they don't deserve to be there. They're unjustly enslaved, they're unjustly imprisoned. And I believe that that's probably generally true if you look at real morality. The state has so many functions that it has to get done. And without legal slavery, you turn to imprisonment. And then it's easy to justify using prisoners for labor because they're criminals. They're hardened criminals that, they have to atone for their sins. So that scene to me was kind of set up a big stage. Some of the language from the other prisoners, aside from Jean Valjean, I think laid out a pretty compelling situation. Another one of my favorite scenes was when he's at the bishop's right after he'd been saved. He's laying in front of the altar, kind of going through this battle with God and deciding what is morality. Who do I owe apologies to? And I think, your point, Robert, about him trying to redeem himself. Does he believe he's a bad person? I would disagree with that a little bit. To me, the story is a man trying to be a good man despite the state's assessment of him, despite the crime that he committed, that he doesn't believe that actually has an effect on him. And the only practical way of him avoiding that punishment is by fleeing the law. But in doing so, everywhere he goes, he improves the lives of everyone he runs across. So to me, there's some pretty powerful moments in the music, and I can get past the musical aspect of it. I understand some people don't like musicals. Myself, I grew up with some theater, so I have a predisposition to that.
Well, you're absolutely right that Valjean improves the lives of everybody he runs across. He starts after he steals the candlesticks and then he's given them by the priest or whatever. But then after that, he starts a factory and he employs people, and then he seems to be a competent contributing member of society. So for that, I'm fully on board with him doing whatever he has to do, short of assaulting people, to get out of going back to jail, which is going to do nobody any good. It's going to completely just make the world a worse place by imprisoning this guy unjustly and taking him out of the workforce, where he's obviously doing a whole lot of good. So. Sure.
Yeah, and the factory scene is really compelling to me. I think that a lot of people might watch that and not even give thought to the fact that here's a capitalist setting up a business and improving the lives of all these people, and that theme comes up a few times throughout the movie. Here are all of these women singing about, well, we need this job, this is improving our lives, we're feeding our kids from it, and here's a guy that went out on his own, and he used the investment in him from the bishop to start that business, but he's creating a business, and in doing so, he's improving the lives of all of his employees. That of course comes up later when they falsely identify someone else as Jean Valjean. He struggles with that. Do I save the one man or all of my employees? And I think that's a pretty compelling internal struggle that he goes through.
Can we talk about Anne Hathaway getting fired?
Sure.
Because I didn't understand why she got fired. It seemed to be that she violated some kind of social norm.
I think so. At the time, she was a single mother that had a child, and at the time, I think that that was much more frowned upon than today. I mean, today you see a single mom of two or three working hard, and she gets praised by her culture, by her society. Where at that time, it's you had a kid, you're done now, you're used, and the foreman had a thing for her clearly. He had goals of making her his own, so to speak. And the fact that she was, he had at that point viewed her as less than desirable because she had been with a man. She had already had a child. And, I think he was definitely not the best of characters in the film. And his simple solution to being turned down indirectly was to just throw her out and get rid of her.
Yeah, I felt like the situation was that there was a social pressure to not have someone who was an unwed mother because it would bring shame upon the business or the rest of the workers there, and also that trouble would follow her because they didn't care why she was a single mother. They didn't care that the husband had either left or died or whatever. They just treated it as if she was just some kind of harlot, right? Just some kind of a loose woman who was going to bring all sorts of trouble upon them. And it was unknown that she had this kid, right? And that's why the foreman was trying to move in on her or whatever. And she had played it up as if she was a virgin, and that's why she was rebutting him or rebuking him. And then when it was revealed that she had a child, then they used that as an excuse to kick her out.
Right. And I think the other women were almost envious of her in a way that she was getting so much attention from the foreman that they wanted to cut that off because they wanted to be in favor of the foreman because that would up their standards. So they brought up the fact that, she has this need. She's going to do whatever she needs to do to fulfill that need, which is caring for her child. When everyone there has a need, if you're without need, you have no reason to go to work. So she wasn't beneath any of them. But I think you're right there that they use the social black eye or the social stigma to say she's desperate. You don't want her on staff.
Right.
So
and
the moral.
Well, I'll let you jump in a second.
Okay, so the moral of this story seems to be make friends and be nice to people and endear yourself to people, because Anne Hathaway didn't have a single person that came up to her for her defense. They were all like, yeah, let's get rid of her. We don't care what the reason is. So, but if she had made some friends, maybe baked some cakes for some friends and gone to some social functions, maybe somebody would have stuck up for her.
I think it's a little more complicated than that, though. I mean, people were definitely ruled by their class and by society then more than now. You couldn't be a free thinker. You couldn't break out of the box and be a standalone, unique person. You kind of had to fall in line at the time. I mean, these people were living under monarchy, so they kind of had to fill the role that they were assigned. Fall in line or fall to the wayside.
Yeah, I find it interesting that it's very made clear when she is fired that the factory was a far better thing in her life than the alternative. Like the alternative was she was out on the streets, she was selling her hair, selling her teeth, becoming a prostitute.
And she fought hard against that for as long as she could.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I get it that it's a story, right? And so they're going to be pushing this, emotional narrative. But in a real situation, there would have been other factories, other places of employment to go to, right? I mean, that's why wages don't just go down and down and down. It's because employers are competing for workers, and that's why wages get driven up. This is why the Irish law of wages is incorrect. So I think for the convenience of the story, we had to have her get totally broken down into this person who's on the street and kind of move things along and have Valjean come in and be the savior. But I don't think that really would have happened in a environment where there were alternatives at other factories. It wasn't like this was the only factory in all of France.
Well, sure, but I think that today that would be much less likely to happen. I didn't live through the time. I'm certainly not a historian, but when you have a political elite class that runs all of the industry, I really think that serves to limit the other alternatives for people that are working. On top of that, I think you had a lot of social stigma at that time. And on top of that, I mean, I'm by no means a historian. I looked up, know a little bit about the time. It was a very turbulent time in France. I mean, they went back and forth from rebellion to republic to rebellion to, I think, the first dictatorship, or they went back and forth from monarchy to empire. That was at a very turbulent time that I think people just didn't have the freedom to establish themselves like Jean Valjean did. I mean, he got lucky a few times, but he was also a very dedicated, committed person that, you know, went out of his way to improve the lives of people in this town. And I think that's why he became mayor.
Yeah, and if we could back up for a little bit, I think that Valjean's situation was interesting because even after he was released on parole, they show like this little snippet of him going to various places to try to stay, you know, like an inn or places to try to get a job, and he had to show his parole paperwork every time. You know, it was like, papers, please. And he kept getting rejected. So there was this pariah status, this ostracism as a result of him having been a criminal, even though it was just he had stolen some bread and he had been in prison for 19 years. You'd think that his debt to society had been paid, but it just shows you how strong ostracism is. And so I felt a great sense of vindication when he tears up those parole papers and says, you know, screw this, I'm not living this way.
Absolutely. I think, go ahead. Robert.
Oh, I was going to jump in and change the subject. So if you want to respond to what Daniel said, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack in that sequence. I mean, you know, at the time he's going through, and yeah, everywhere you go, you have to have papers. And that came up later in the movie, I think once or maybe twice. You know, you have to show your papers, your government papers. And once you're in that system, and I think we see that today, you know, I think the box on the application, you know, have you been convicted of a federal crime? Yes or no, not please explain. You're just a criminal. You're a felon. And that's what he was to society at that point. When if people really knew he stole a loaf of bread in a moment of desperation to save his sister's starving child, they would have more compassion as human beings. But all they see is, here's a felon. You know, we don't want him around. So that's a failure of the system he's operating in. And I thought that was a powerful story. And then he finally shows up at the church, and for the first time, someone offers him compassion. They offer him, you know, salvation. He says, "I've saved your soul for God." He forgives him immediately. He doesn't care where he came from. And then even after he steals from him, he backs his story up to the lawmen because he realizes this man just needs a little forgiveness. And that ended up changing Valjean's life. And yeah, when he tore up the papers, that scene, I mentioned it before, he's laying in front of the altar. I relate to that a lot because, you know, I think the first time I had thoughts of morality versus law was when I was being confirmed in church as a child. Had a pretty powerful moment, not anywhere close to what he had, but him realizing that I don't owe the legal system any more penance, that I'm going to do my best in front of my God. And that was a big turning point for him.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a far better, it's more of an individual thing. It's like morality is objective for the most part, you know, and people have a subjective situation like in some of the gray areas, but the level of a number of laws that exist, law does not mean morality, right? Law does not make morality. I have a thing I'll put on the show notes page as well that basically outlines how many pages and how many links the football field it would take to fill, you know, to actually show all the laws in the United States. It's ridiculous. It's several football fields in length. You know, and lawmakers, that's their job, is to go and make more and more laws and regulations. And many of them contradictory, many of them totally immoral. It's just, it's crazy to think that people sit there with a straight face and think that, well, if it's against the law, then it's immoral. And if it's a law, then it must be moral.
Funny aside, I met a state prosecutor at a bar one night. We were talking for a few minutes, and she told me she was a lawyer at first, and we were talking, and then she told me she was a state prosecutor, and I asked her how she could sleep at night, and I don't think she was expecting that response.
Were you in the movie Collateral? That's what happened in that movie.
Yeah, I was not in the movie Collateral.
But if only, so in this movie, I think it's funny that all the problems in this movie would have been solved by communism. If only France had communism in the early 1800s, then Jean Valjean could have just waited in a bread line for a couple hours to get his bread, and then this movie wouldn't have happened. But you know, I don't mean to straw man communism, but I've heard in the past, one of the kind of critiques of capitalism is that you get a situation like this, where people are so money hungry that you'll lock a man in jail for stealing a loaf of bread. When in reality, it's capitalism that generates the wealth that allows for there to be such bounty that a guy could just give a guy a loaf of bread. Yeah, sure, you really need it, go for it. It's not that big a deal. Anyway, it's interesting.
I agree with you 100%. And I think this movie, what I like so much about film is that well, and sometimes I dislike it, but three different people can watch a movie and get three different things out of it. And I watch it and see, here's a guy that was enslaved for a small crime by the state because the state needed human capital. That state is affecting the situation. It's not capitalism that put Valjean in jail. In fact, he breaks out, and capitalism is what saves him. It's what saves the people around him. He finds a societal need, he fills that need, and in doing so, everyone that helps him along the way, all the people he employs, their lives improve, as well as the people's in town whose needs are being fulfilled by his activity. And along the entire way, it's Javert is trying to slow him down, and an actor of the state is trying to get in his way. And then there's a scene with, there's two scenes actually where they pull through town in carriages and these very wealthy people come through. Well, they're not capitalists, they're politically connected people. They're not producing things like Valjean is. They're sitting at the top using the very powerful monarchical system that's employed at the time to better themselves, because they're selfish in a way that has state power behind it. They're not selfish in a way that they want to maximize their value, maximize their company's value, and thus fill needs of the people around them.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and I would tend to agree that most of the problems are the result of the state in this particular story. The vibe I got, you mentioned that three different people will watch it and see three different things. I got the vibe that this was actually supportive of the ideas of communism and revolution, and the people being willing to revolt if there was just a spark and an instigation by the students when Lamarck died, and that it was almost how do you say this, like glorifying it, like making it look like a noble and heroic thing?
Yeah, I very much saw the same thing, Daniel. It seemed to me that the student revolution, which was pointless and aimless except to get people killed, was all for freedom, but they had no plan, no aim, no goal. Just this generic idea of, well, we're just going to kill some soldiers and fight for freedom. Well, what's it going to achieve? Well, we don't know. We're gonna barricade this area of a road. What's that gonna achieve? Oh, we don't know. It's gonna do something, probably. Viva la revolution! It seemed to make no sense.
Well, they were trying to get the people to rise up. They wanted to be that spark. So they thought if they were resisting the existing government, then the people in general would then rise up in response.
Okay, so
and
why not just
revolution?
Why not just ignore them? They don't have any hostages. They haven't taken any significant territory. They're just hanging out in their homes, essentially, except they blockade one street. Well, go to a different street.
Because ideas are dangerous, Robert.
Not a couple of angry college kids. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of angry college kids these days, and I mostly just ignore them.
Well, sure, but they're motivated by the same things that those people are. I mean, there's a lot of things about that angry mob that I very much dislike, but I think there's a lot that I can relate to. They're fighting against what they view as their oppressor, and we see that even today. I mean, now we've mastered it. I mean, these people are fighting cholera and starvation. They have something real to fight against. Today, you see people being motivated by politics to fight against their quote-unquote oppressors. Like, are you really being oppressed? No, but they feel that they are. And like today in presidential elections, even, people feel, I'm fighting it for a change. I'm fighting for a revolution, when it's not a real revolution. And, going back to these folks, they were fighting against one aspect of something in their life they didn't like, but they didn't have a grand scheme of, this is what we want. We just don't want this anymore. Give me something else. And then at that time in France, I mean, there was many revolutions and political voids, and, you take the shit out and more shit comes back in. Pardon my French, but they were kind of
what you did there.
They were aimlessly fighting for something different, not knowing what it was. And
now, Alex, it's La Merde.
What's that? Le Merde. Yes, correct.
Yeah, for French.
Right.
Bad jokes aside, continue for a moment here.
No, I struggle with that scene too. I think more so in the recent years that I've watched the film, like, these people don't know what the hell they're doing, but they know that they're fighting against something, and that's such a strong motivator for people. And yes, they really had aimless ends, but they knew that they were fighting against something that was actually bad for them.
Right. They remind me of just like today's protesters, who are just angry about something. They're not exactly sure what, but they are angry.
I'm with you there.
Yeah,
and it doesn't matter like what the idea that they're angry about is. It's the person who exemplifies whatever they're angry about. Because the next person who's in line for the presidency or whatever, they can do the exact same thing, and if it's their team, they're totally fine with it. We saw this with Bush to Obama and Obama to Trump. Basically the same policies are in place, and the left is outraged when it's Bush doing it. fine when Obama's doing it, and he gave Trump basically carte blanche to do the things. So now people aren't upset about Trump doing the things that Obama did. They're upset about him like saying mean things or tweeting.
Right, and you didn't see a whole bunch of like right-wing protests all the time during Obama. Just didn't quite happen.
Well, that would be racist.
Can we talk about, okay, before we really get into this or after we get into this, whatever. I mean, we're probably already running out of time. This is crazy. There's so much to talk about in this movie. But the one most unrealistic thing that I saw in this film is the innkeeper, that this place is even in business. So as soon as like a customer comes in, they're robbing the guy. They're shaking the guy down. The guy doesn't even know he's been robbed. Then they're feeding him like people parts and rat feces and all kinds of garbage. And even if the guy doesn't see anybody steal from him, like he walks into his inn and he gets robbed and he's like, oh, wait, I got robbed. Even if he doesn't know who did it, he's still going to go, well, I'm probably not going to go back to that place again. I'm going to tell everybody I know that I got robbed there. I just can't see. And it, you know, later on in the movie, the proprietors are like living in the sewer or something, or just they're robbing people on the street or whatever. But the fact that they even have an inn in the beginning of the movie, I call BS on.
Yeah, I have no idea how they came to such means, but I can definitely see how they lost such means.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I guess there wasn't.
It's a fun scene. Don't get me wrong. It's a fun scene of them like robbing everybody and like master of the house and that kind of thing. And there's a whole bunch of cultural like things I'd seen, like the Master of the House and the I Dreamed a Dream and a couple other songs that I recognized, like just in the culture. So this is obviously some kind of like famous cultural movie. It was fun to actually see that for the first time.
Yeah, so to me, the innkeepers were probably the least interesting, had the worst character arc of any of the developmental arc of any of the characters. But they served one purpose in the movie, which was at the very end, basically. But what I did like was the development between Eponine, their natural daughter, and Cosette. You know, Cosette was kind of kept down. She was basically a child slave. And they treated her daughter very well. And that completely reversed when they met again as adults. And it was interesting to see, you know, the lifestyle that Cosette eventually found herself in, an honorable man. She was raised well, and now she's, you know, of means. And Eponine, she was raised in this environment of theft, complete lack of moral character. And here she is on the streets, basically running petty crimes to get by day. You know, I thought that was interesting. You know, they set it up early and then brought it back home later on. My least favorite part about this movie is the Castle on a Cloud song, to me. And
remind me which one that one is.
That was Cosette in The Innkeeper. Before she goes out to fetch the water from the wood, she sings a song about a castle on a cloud. And I understand why you would forget it, because they completely ruined it in the film. It's a beautiful song. I've seen it multiple other times, and it's one of my favorite songs in the production, and they completely ruined it in this film.
I was going to ask you, since you had recommended this, that if you were more familiar with the source material, and I was curious about how well this translated.
The source material is a book that was written, I think, 40 or 50 years after the revolution. Not one book, it was like a series, 7 or 8 books. It's thousands of pages long that I think I read something that no one would ever read it. I've since found out that one of my friends actually read it when she was a kid, which is insane. But yeah, it was a very long book that was adapted into theater and then eventually into several movies.
It was Victor Hugo, right? Victor Hugo? Is that right?
That sounds right.
Yeah, it is Victor Hugo. And there were movies made as far back as the 1930s. And the Broadway production, I believe, started in the late 70s or early 80s. And it ran for something like 15 or 25 years on Broadway. And then it's no longer on Broadway, but I'm sure they're still doing productions, you know, various places. Where have you seen it? Did you go to New York?
No, that would be awesome. I saw it in Ohio a couple times on stage. And then, there's a lot of theater where I grew up.
How long is it in a play form? I'm curious, because you got all those acts and you got the curtains going up and down and changing the sets.
The intermission.
It's got to be like a 6-hour marathon.
Probably about as long, but the interesting thing when you go from a stage production to a movie production, Robert, you'd probably hate the stage production because it's actually more music and less conversation than in a movie.
Oh, God.
That's my general observation is when musicals go to film, they add more dialogue, they add more visual scenes, where on a stage you kind of have to force the viewer to use their imagination for certain aspects of the production.
Right, and you'd have no no subtitles, Robert.
No subtitles, Robert.
Be like going to the opera for me. What are they talking about? I don't know.
But yeah, so I saw a pretty small stage production of it in Dayton, Ohio, in fact, where Javert jumping off the bridge. They did it amazingly on a very small stage, very low budget, and they didn't have, obviously on film, they could do a lot more with it, actually show him falling and kind of brutally breaking on the, whatever that is, the dock. It's not a dock, but it was where the movie started, by the way. He jumped off the bridge and fell into where they were pulling ships in after the battle, the revolution, some 9 years earlier, or however many years earlier it was.
Okay. So is that like a ship lock? Is that what that is? The lock?
Yeah, I think that's where the large ships they pulled in, and they could raise or lower the water level to bring the boats up to dock. Yeah.
Yeah, I got to say that opening scene with the ships and everything. I know it's like 90% CGI. It was pretty amazing. Like some really great visuals there. I think Tom Hooper's known for having these a lot of movement in his shots and a lot of spectacle in his framing, and a lot of jostling too. And my little cheat move, Robert, was I watched this via YouTube at 1.5 speed with the
you son of a bitch cheater. Screw you.
With the words on. And so it was almost like they were talking, because it was almost like normal speech cadence. And then we could see the words, and it was a little sing-songy, but we got through this thing in like under 2 hours. So
I'll have my revenge.
You're a cheater.
It'll be fine. I'll get my revenge. You will know pain.
Oh, I know. But anyway, yeah, it was. I thought it was a beautifully shot film, and great kind of presentation. But it also did feel very stagey in a way. Like you could tell that they were trying to sort of, show that in their presentation. Like, hey, this is a theater show, but we're just adding a bunch of CGI around it.
Sure. One thing I appreciate about that too, I mean, there was a time when culture was disseminated through the stage, the theater, and generally only the wealthy people could consume that culture. And a lot of people today turn their nose up at film productions of theater, but in actuality, what that is there's a company that realizes I can disseminate this to masses and make a lot of money, but the result of that is more people get to consume that culture, that part of our culture. And that's kind of why I thought the 2012 version would be good, was that it was more contemporary. Maybe some of your listeners would relate to it more than like a 60s version.
Yeah, I'm curious what the 1999 version with Jeffrey Rush would have been like, because I don't believe that one was a musical.
Oh, really? I'd have to check that out.
So I assume the Broadway version is a musical then, but obviously the original text, I assume, doesn't have like music lyrics and that sort of thing. It's all just written out like a story, I would suppose.
I think it was a much more complicated story, being however many thousands of pages long it was. Probably a little more gruesome at times and, real. But I haven't read any of it, so I don't really know.
Well, that's good. What did you think of the acting and all that, Alex?
In general, I think it was generally good. I think Hugh Jackman is one of the better actors of our time. A guy that can go from shooting knives out of his hands and slicing people up to, parting his hair and singing Broadway musicals on film. I think he's pretty impressive. Russell Crowe, I thought, did a good job. I think his villain character had more depth to it than you see in other villains, maybe of contemporary film. He was pretty consistent, but you got to know him throughout the film more deeply. That scene where after Fantine dies and they have the sword fight, and he says, such and such, I'm from the gutter too, before Jean Valjean jumps out of the window. So you learn a little bit more and more about him throughout the film, up until the moment when he can't take any more forgiveness from this man that he's condemned so deeply in his soul, and he's so torn about it, he can't live with himself. And I think back to your early point, Robert, they kind of use some of the same music when he's walking across the dam that they used in Jean Valjean's scene when he's realizing his forgiveness from God. So that kind of draws your attention back to Valjean's salvation and Javert's realization of his maybe undeserved forgiveness. And they handle it such different ways. Valjean goes off and starts a great life and, goes out and becomes a capitalist and improves the lives of people. Javert jumps off a freaking bridge. He just can't live with his life being turned upside down in that way.
Yeah, I really did appreciate the turn of Javert. I still don't understand. I mean, maybe it was lost in translation, or maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention, but I really didn't understand the tenacity with which Javert went after Jean Valjean. I kind of lost that, but I do appreciate the human aspects of Javert. He was a fully rounded character. I did appreciate that. He had a nice arc.
And he was, so him and Valjean were driven by basically the same things. They both were very religious men. Javert saw his duty to God to enforce the laws of man, and he was so committed to that. And Valjean, he saw his duty to God to improve the lives of those around him, and he did that throughout the movie.
But Jean Valjean's crimes compared to the innkeeper's crimes, it's not even close, man.
I'm not siding with Valjean's imprisonment at all. not in the slightest.
I mean, Javert, you got crooks just standing right in front of your face. Arrest those guys.
Well, right. I think he's more driven by the fact that he escaped him, kind of getting his own revenge. And he even said that when Valjean didn't kill him. He said, he could have got his revenge right then. He had the knife, he had the gun. He's a vengeful person. He lives his life that way. And they both live their lives under the same book, under the same text, the Bible. They just interpret it very differently. And I think that points to some very interesting aspects of our current culture. People do horrific things under the name of the Bible. They also do wonderful things under the name of the Bible.
If I could take us back to the innkeeper couple doing all these heinous crimes, basically continuously for years. But if you've got this society where stealing bread is going to get you 5 years in prison, you'd think that would be a pretty strong deterrent, right? That appealing to this law of man with this kind of harsh punishment would make people reticent to do these types of criminal activities, yet they flaunt it. And it's amazing that they never got caught, even till the end. I mean, sure, they lost their business probably because, this 1832 version of Yelp was. Their reviews got out there and they were very low. So they lost their inn, but they still never got arrested and never got imprisoned themselves for crimes that were far, far worse than what Valjean ever did. And so if the theory of the, law and punishment, criminal aspect is a deterrence theory, it didn't really shine through in this. It didn't seem that the harsh punishments was much of a deterrence for the innkeeper couple.
I would agree with you. And I would also advocate that, that system is unjust in the same way that our current legal system is unjust. Making it illegal does not make it immoral, and it doesn't prevent people from committing the acts. The innkeepers ended up on the street. That's real justice. They live immoral lives. And I assume, to your point, Robert, people probably did stop going to them because they were being robbed. How else did they lose their livelihoods?
There is one thing that Borat said or Ali G said. And
let's stick with that.
That was when the innkeeper was caught by Valjean. No, am I saying that right? Javert. And Valjean escapes or leaves the scene of the crime, and he was the victim of the crime. And so Perrier says, in the absence of the victim, may I go? And, basically no victim, no crime, which is a modern day thing that I would advocate for. And I want to harp on that for a moment, bring it up, because I think that it's a very important point.
Absolutely. We can harp on that all you want, because I love to harp on that myself. The state often brings people in for victimless crimes and claims that, the person withstanding or the victim is the state itself, which is hilarious. Like, what do you mean? An idea is the victim? Because that's all the state is. It's an idea. It's a concept. It doesn't actually exist.
And it's not even a good concept.
But in order to have standing, you have to show damages against, somebody who owns some property. But yeah, a concept can't own property. A concept can't get hurt and damaged and destroyed. It's ridiculous.
I'm with you. Yeah. And going back to your point about the wrongful imprisonment, like Valjean committed a crime. He stole a loaf of bread. 19 years is not a just punishment for that. He should probably pay for the loaf of bread somehow, or sweep the floors long enough to pay for the loaf of bread. That would be a real justice. But yeah, absolutely. No victim, no crime. I mean,
right. Ask what the shop owner, the bread owner, what he wants, what he thinks is just punishment.
Right. Yeah, it's another thing. It's a very great point, Robert. Much of criminal justice in the United States and in the world today isn't restitution for the victims of the crime. There's no recompense for them. It's about meting out punishment for the accused, for the quote unquote criminal. Yeah, even if there is a victim.
But Daniel, if you don't pay your taxes, you've basically stolen from the beneficiaries of those taxes. You thieving bastard.
He's a terrible person. I've been saying this all along.
Well, just for the record, I do pay the taxes demanded of me. I don't want to say they're my taxes because I don't have really much of a choice in them. Though this is an interesting point. A friend of ours, a friend of the show, has been a guest a few times, had a comment on Facebook the other day speaking about taxes. And somebody replied and said, well, you're choosing it, so it's consensual. And everyone was telling him, no, there's a gun to your head. You know, a rape victim who has a knife to their ribs isn't consenting to being raped by choosing between being murdered or raped. You know what I'm saying? Like he's conflating the act of making a choice out of two bad decisions where the morality of it is totally removed from that decision, right? And making that equate to consensual.
Right. And everyone sees that when you talk about the rape victim, but I don't know how you break through that wall when you're talking about something such as the state that people are so conditioned to deem necessary. It's just, that's a tall task, I've noticed in my life.
It is.
Anyway.
There's massive amounts of conditioning. It's a tough nut to crack.
All right. So I have one more point, and then we can get into some final summaries and reviews, or any last points that Alex, you have, or Robert. But mine goes back to the revolution, the Red and Black, you know, their song with Lamarck, who dies of cholera. And they use that as their time to strike. And I viewed, they said that Lamarck was a man of the people. He was a bureaucrat for the people. And I likened that to our modern day Bernie Sanders, right? And that ties right in line with my ideation that this was a socialist revolution that they were trying to spark, and it just never took root. And I think that the reason it never took root is because by this time in France, there were factories, despite all of the monarchy and the privilege of only the ones who are bestowed, you know, basically monopoly protections were allowed to have factories, that the lives of the people were in fact improved versus the alternative in prior in their history. And so they weren't as bad off as they would have been. And so they were not necessarily primed to do a revolution. Like that inevitability of Marx's revolution, the proletariat rising up against the bourgeois because of the iron law of wages, and they would get further and further oppressed, and that they only get subsistence wages, and then somehow wages are supposed to go down. So how would that even work? Because it's a non-starter. Like if they're already at subsistence, and if they went down, then wouldn't they all be dead? Anyway, I viewed that this basically the whole movie is about praising the socialist revolution that never came because the people were better off as a result of capitalism and the factory system.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, sir. Yeah, I don't know exactly the nature of the communist revolution in Russia. That's the nature. I mean, they had just had World War I, which had brutalized, you know, slaughtered a whole bunch of their people. And I'm not exactly sure if they were really industrialized, but I think they were fairly pre-industrial at the time. So that would kind of lend to your argument as to, allowing a socialist revolution to really take hold.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it was a fairly agrarian society prior to that, and that one of the first things that they tried to do after the revolution was to rapidly industrialize.
Right. Like Stalin's 5-year plan or whatever it was.
Well, it was Lenin first and then Stalin.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Alex, you're about to chime in.
No, I guess I thought less about communism in watching those scenes that I think you're referring to, and more about the current day Yellow Jacket, quote unquote, revolution, where they're, you know, gathered in the streets and bringing out the guillotines for a gas tax, but they're not really fighting for less state intervention. Their list of demands is incredibly socialist, and it's just such a misguided use of rebellion, I think, and I agree that, you know, the masses that we saw in this film were probably representative of the time. They were misguided. They were fighting against something they disliked, but keep giving me more free stuff, right? They want less free stuff for them, more free stuff for me. That's what, you know, the Bernies that you're talking about. They're very efficient at selling that concept to voters today.
Yeah, the politics of envy, for sure.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They do a good job of exploiting, you know, perceived injustice, because the youth have a lot of energy, they have a lot of anger, and they have a lot of righteousness and righteous fury, and they can be directed, you know, in certain directions. But as far as, you know, they struck me as, you know, bureaucrats waiting to happen. Like they are just wanting their turn at the levers of power in order to grant themselves other people's stuff.
Well, what would you rather sell if you were a salesman selling two things? Take down the rich people, and then we all have more, or take down the rich people, and then we can live independently, and then we have to keep fighting for ourselves at that point rather than versus someone. You know, the individualism, the freedom, liberty aspect is a much harder sell, because you're telling people we have to get the oppressors out of the way and then continue fighting to be self-sufficient, you know, stand on your own.
Right. I mean, because there's this view who have a lot have gained it unjustly, and that they want to right the wrong. Like people like Ocasio-Cortez, who says that, not all billionaires are immoral, but essentially all billionaires are immoral. You can't be a moral billionaire because if, you provide that much value, you must have been doing something wrong. And yeah, a lot of people do. They interact with government. They push at the levers of power. They have lobbyists, but those are kind of the rules of the game. We've talked about this quite a bit on this podcast. It's not the most moral thing to do, but when, every dollar of lobbyist you put into lobbyists buys you, $2 worth of value, it's hard to say to your investors and your shareholders, no, we're not going to do that. It's tough. It's tough to be a moral business person and try and operate outside. It's hard to gulch it, in this world. It really is.
Yeah, the deck is certainly stacked against you in this paradigm, which is rather unfortunate, because if the free market were allowed to be unleashed, then everyone's standard of living would raise significantly, and everyone would be better off. It would be an amazing thing. There would be so much untapped potential out there in the world that who knows where we'd be today. It would be incredible. That's a very message,
Sure. Just in the recent weeks, you hear politicians clamoring for, political campaign finance reform. They don't want political campaign finance reform. That's how they get paid. They want to hide it. They're playing a shell game. If you want a real political campaign finance reform, get the power out of politics, the money will follow. To me, that's the only solution. Let's pass a law to make the other laws work better. It is not the way out of this mess.
Yeah, there's not enough laws, right, Alex?
That's right. Yeah.
I'll have that picture.
We're just one law away from utopia.
That's right. Just one more. All right. Well, it's about that time. So let's get into our final summary and reviews. Alex, I know that you are a listener of the show, so you know how this works. We'll ask you to give the summary review and then a score out of 10, a decimal point deep, please.
Sure. Like I said, I'm a big fan of this story. I knew it before I saw the film. I thought that they did a really good job with it. The cinematography was great. I thought the music was well composed. I thought that it did advance the plot line. But again, I came into it with an understanding of the film. The general story, I think Valjean is probably one of the best heroes that exists in this type of film. He's driven by principle. He's guided by his morality. He separates the law from that morality. He improves the lives of everyone he crosses. His antagonist, Javert. I enjoyed his character. I didn't like him, but I enjoyed how they introduced him over time. I thought the story was strong. It was a man that climbed out of despair and built a better world, not only for himself, but everyone around him. I thought his relationship with Cosette was maybe a little underdeveloped in this film version, but she played an integral role in sort of the transition from the first half of the movie to the second half, which for me, I can watch the first half and stop and not even finish the movie. Like, to me, Jean Valjean's development is what I watch the movie for. And for that alone, it's one of my, definitely one of my top musicals. I don't know if I'd say top movies, but so if I had to rate it, after last week, I thought about just rating it like 16 to really just break that glass ceiling that you guys have been working on, but I'm not going to do that. I'd say probably 9.5. And the reason that I would knock it down half a point was I thought Cosette was a little underdeveloped in the film, and they ruined Castle on a Cloud.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for that, Alex. I'll take a turn and then we'll go to Robert. So I felt like that this movie might have been a little bit, you used the word underdeveloped for Cosette. I think that some of the transition points were a bit underdeveloped, and I got a little bit lost in the timeline. Like, they did mention that, 8 years later, 9 years later, a couple of times, but like right after the failed revolution, the student revolution, then all of a sudden, we got Wolverine like dying at the monastery. Wasn't that, a few years later? Because he had just done some heroic, strength stuff. And then all of a sudden he's this like battered old man. So I got a little bit lost there. And then some of the moments that I think were super important to the story, I don't think they were very emphasized in this iteration of it. And I feel like maybe one of the other film adaptations, or perhaps reading the novel, might have a little bit more impact. But the visuals were stunning, and I felt that this was a well done movie. And I did read a little bit in the background, and Logan did lose, I think, 60 or more pounds to do his imprisonment scene. So he was very, very gaunt, very thin. He would go for runs every day for 45 minutes on an empty stomach and then only eat like, I don't know, a few hundred calories or something crazy. And he was also working with a voice coach every day to get his singing range expanded, because I guess he was a baritone and he needed to sing tenor for this. So his dedication to the role, I think, did pay dividends. I think that he did a great job. I found that Russell Crowe's performance, he's like the same in every movie. So you put Russell Crowe in and his voice, even though he's singing, kind of just sounds like it's Russell Crowe, but a little sing-songy. I mean, I like him, but it didn't really stand out for me. So I don't know. I'm going to go with like a 7.1 on this. I did appreciate that you recommended it. I think it had a lot of really interesting things worth talking about. And so I might actually go and check out the Jeffrey Rush version just to get another angle on the story and without as much singing, and see what I think of it from that point. I can tell you I'm not going to read a several thousand page novel version of it. I've got too many books to read as it is. But let's go to Robert, and then we will wind down the show here.
Well, those are two very good takes. I just got done watching this film, so this is a bit of a hot take. So forgive me if it's not the most in-depth. But like I said throughout this episode, this movie wasn't really made for Robert. I enjoyed it for what it was, and I'm glad it exists. And it's definitely made for somebody, just not necessarily for me. This is obviously a high-quality production, though. It attracted a whole lot of excellent talent from the production, from the director, the actors. I would echo Daniel's sentiments on the actors. Crowe, who I found the best character. I liked his arc the most. I really enjoyed his going from this passionate guy to a guy who kills himself at the end because he's been forgiven by Valjean. Is a really powerful sentiment. But the acting of Jackman is just fantastic, and his dedication to the role, like you were saying, is amazing. But for me, this movie comes down to the story of Jean Valjean, and I can appreciate Alex's take on it. For him, it's more about him being this fantastic character. For me, I wanted Valjean to have more motivation. I love his fight against the state and his moral character of recognizing that my morality trumps your dumb laws. That's what I'm all about. This is what the whole podcast is about. That's fantastic. But I wanted more of an arc from him. I didn't want him to just be the Superman the whole time. I wanted him to be a really flawed character at the beginning, and I didn't see any of that. I wanted some kind of redemption. I wanted him to actually do something really, really bad and then kind of have to atone and kind of move beyond it instead of just being this great guy the whole time. So I appreciate that everybody gets different things out of this film. It's definitely a complex work, and it seems to be able to be adapted in multiple ways. It's obviously a story that stood the test of time, but this particular iteration of it just wasn't for me. So I'm going to actually give it a negative review, and I probably shouldn't. It's kind of terrible for me to say this, but I'm going to give it like a 4.5. It's not a 4.5 movie, but for Robert, it's a 4.5 movie, if that makes any sense. So for anybody else, I'm sure you're going to like it more than I did. And, good on you for enjoying it, because it is a quality production. And I'm glad we had this discussion. Thank you, Alex, for coming on the show and talking about it and getting in all these interesting points.
I appreciate the invite, and I was bracing myself for you to go negative as a -0, below 0.
No, it's a good movie. It's good. Well, it's a high quality production. I'll put it that way. But it's just I think Susan Boyle's rendition of "I Dreamed a Dream" is better than Hannah Hathaway's. By the way.
Oh, now I'm gonna have to post that in the show notes. All right,
it's a great clip.
All right, that sounds good. Well, Alex, again, thank you very much. We did really have a fun time talking about this with you, and we appreciate you being a listener and recommending it and being a guest. And Robert, I'm going to change the tone here as we're winding this down. So we mentioned the GoFundMe for our Patreon supporter, Joe. So if you want to support him in any way, you can go to lastnighters.com/Joe, and that will go to his GoFundMe as he fights against cancer. And then our next movie, oh man, this is going to get real sad, is another GoFundMe related thing, because a friend of ours who does Libertopia cartoons, and he went by the name Louis Liberman, has died recently. He passed away, leaving a wife and son, and he was my age, so it's very sudden and very sad. And he was a guest with us a couple of shows on Ghostbusters and Equilibrium, and we had planned on having him back to do Brazil, the Terry Gilliam movie. I believe that's the director of it. And so next week, Robert, I think I would like to do that in tribute to Lewis, and we will do a link at lastnighters.com/Lewis, Lewis, and that will go to the GoFundMe if you would like to support his wife and family in going through this difficult time.
Absolutely. Let's do it. Well, hopefully our episode will do justice to his memory, because he was a great guest and he will be missed.
Yeah, and I actually do have some of his commentary as he was suggesting and being excited about doing this, so I will be able to talk about what his take was on the movie a little bit. So we will be back next week with Brazil. So thank you guys for joining us for this episode. Thank you, Alex. Sorry to end it on such a downer here. This has been the Last Nighters episode 58, and you can find this on the Launchpad Media, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. And I will say good night from last night, everybody. All right, and we'll continue for a few more minutes on the Actual Anarchy podcast. And it looks like Robert actually left for a moment, so maybe he'll chime back in. I don't know. But Alex, thank you. Oh, there he is. So Alex, thanks again for being a guest for us. And I had debated on whether to bring up that situation at the beginning of the episode or at the end, and I'm glad I waited until the end, because it is very sad, and I felt like it might have changed the tone of the conversation.
Sure.
Yeah, anyway, we're still recording right now. But anyway, why don't we get into some Kathleen Turner Overdrive, which is available for our Patreon supporters. And if people want to get a hold of that, they can go to actualanarchy.com/Patreon. We will also have the GoFundMes for Joe and for Lewis under the Actual Anarchy domain. So actualanarchy.com/Joe, Joe, and actualanarchy.com/Lewis, Lewis. Those will go to both of their GoFundMes. And this has been episode 115 of the Actual Anarchy podcast. We're going to get into some Kathleen Turner Overdrive with our guest, Alex, as we were discussing Les Miserables. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.
The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.